We'll begin by taking refuge, developing bodhicitta, and reciting the prayer to
Sangye Chötang Soki Chonam La Chanchu Patu Dani Kyapsu Chi Dagi Jinso Gi Pe Senam Ki Cholam Penchil Sangye Chupa Shu Sangye Chötang Soki Chonam La Chanchu Patu Dani Kyapsu Chi Dagi Jinso Gi Pe Senam Ki Chola Penshi Sangye Juba Sho Sangye Chetang Soki Chonam La Janchu Patu Dani Kyapsu Chi Dagi Jinso Gi Pe Senam Ki Chola Penshi Sangye Juba Sho Chom den de jambe yon la chak sa lo Gangi lo je trim ni trim Ni ta nam da krab sa loe Jinye den que j'ai shi si shir Ni ki tu ka lek bam si Gang dak si pet sa na marik Min tum dunya gi si we Dotso kina buchi ta se yana du chu yong de so. Do ta cha do nye mo ni lo le ki cha do cho se ching. Marik mit se do nya nyogu chi nye che zi ral drinam. De ne da chi sa chu ta sa yen ten lu zo gyal se tu ku chu da chu ni gen tre da kle min sa jam pe yong la du se den ke ki ken ha be se ki da kle ti mu min parab se ne Katan ten shu lu to pai lo je pe no wa tsel tu sa.
Hello. The text that we are studying today is a treatise composed by the first Mipham Rinpoche. It is titled The Entry Toward the State of a Pandita. This treatise is presented based on the teachings of Khenpo Chödrak Rinpoche, who gave them starting in 2010 at Dhagpo Kagyuling. We are presenting these teachings, repeating these teachings. Khenpo Chödrak Rinpoche uses the first Mipham Rinpoche's treatise and also a commentary by Khenpo Nyuden, who was a direct disciple of the first Mipham Rinpoche. First, the author of this treatise, the first Mipham Rinpoche, was named Jamyang Mipham Gyamsa. He was a Buddhist master who lived in the 19th century. He was a great scholar and also accomplished in terms of his meditative practice. Over the course of his life, he focused a great deal on the practice of Manjushri and encountered Manjushri in person. He carried out a 21-year retreat, and following this retreat, he composed numerous treatises based on the accomplishment of his practice. Overall, he composed 38 volumes, The entry toward the state of a Pandita is one of these treatises. This treatise that we are studying is a Shastra. It belongs to the basket of the Abhidharma. What is explained in this text? All knowable phenomena are explained, both in terms of their vastness and their depth. This treatise has three main parts: the 10 themes, the 4 seals, and the 4 types of perfect knowledge. Knowable phenomena in its vastness, in their vastness, are the 10 modes of being, and knowable phenomena in terms of depth are, for example, emptiness. In the context of this treatise, this concerns the 4 seals. Based on true knowledge of the 10 themes and the 4 seals, we will be able to deploy an activity that is truly beneficial for beings. In other words, teaching the Dharma. And this occurs based on the 4 types of authentic knowledge. Concerning these 3 parts, we are focusing on the first part, the 10 themes, the 10 modes of being. In order to understand the purpose of this text, we'll look at the root text, which says, early on, it's not in the section that you have, one who wishes to obtain discernment that determines without error the mode of being of the knowable, must train in the 10 modes of being, and know them in the way of a Pandita, such as they are taught in the sutras and the great treatises. One who wishes to obtain discernment that determines without error the mode of being of the knowable must train in the 10 modes of being and know them in the way of a Pandita, as they are taught in the sutras and the great treatises. As we saw, the 10 themes that are laid out in this treatise present knowable phenomena in terms of their vastness, and they remedy 10 mistaken ways of grasping a self. These are 10 ways of envisioning an identity. This notion of a self is the opposite of the true nature of reality. It is a very strong idea that persists throughout all our lives. Why is it useful to remedy self-grasping? Because self-grasping is responsible for our wandering in samsara and therefore our suffering. For example, based on this grasping, we develop afflictive obscurations such as ignorance, desire, and aversion, and we act based on these afflictive obscurations. We accumulate non-virtuous actions that will lead us to experience suffering. Therefore, if we truly wish to free ourselves from suffering, it is important to remedy this grasping. This way that we have of thinking that we truly exist, we justify it with various reasons. The first reason is that we consider the self of the individual to be a single unit with an identity. Buddhism refutes this postulate by explaining that what we call an individual is made up of a collection of aggregates. We are made up in terms of body and mind of numerous things, countless things, and this is not compatible with the idea of an individual self, an indivisible self. In this sense, the theme of the five aggregates remedies self-grasping in terms of a unit. This knowledge of the five aggregates won't immediately remedy the idea of a self, but Rinpoche tells us that this knowledge will be useful at a certain point in our meditation in order to progress towards unveiling our Buddha nature. That is one of the reasons that we use to justify the idea that we truly exist. Another reason is thinking of ourselves as being the agent of an action. I exist because I do things. I'm the one who did this, that. Here, the self is seen as the cause that allows for accomplishing actions. In order to refute this argument, Buddhism lays out the category of the dhatus. It explains that it's not possible to find a single cause for the production of things. This rather concerns a combination of factors that interact and then seem to produce a result. The theme of the 18 dhatus remedies self-grasping, grasping a self as a cause. A third reason that we use to justify the existence of a self is that we exist because we experience things. For example, if I eat an apple, I can taste the apple. So, of course, I exist. In order to refute this argument, Buddhism teaches the Ayatanas to show that there is not a singular person who experiences, a self that experiences. The theme of the 12 Ayatanas remedies grasping an identity as a self who experiences. In the previous courses, we covered the first two themes, the aggregates and the dhatus. And during this course, for the next 3 days, we'll study this theme of the Ayatanas. We'll go over half of it during this course, and the next half we'll continue with that in the next course in December. Before we jump into the subject itself, we wanted to share 4 obstacles to study that Jigme Rinpoche shared with us, that we wanted to share, we wanted to share with you. He told us that when we study, there is a danger or a pitfall of forgetting our objective, forgetting why we study, forgetting the goal of the subject, the purpose of the subject that we're studying. The second obstacle that we can encounter when we study a text, such as the entry to the state of a Pandita, is that we'll rush into things, we'll go too fast. In order to remedy this obstacle, it's important to realize that true understanding takes time. He clarified that studying takes time. It's not something that you can do quickly, but it's okay. It's not a problem that it takes time. It's important to go slowly and be precise in our studies in order to look for the meaning, rather than to want to go fast and rush because we wanted to go quickly. A third obstacle that he mentioned is getting discouraged. If we forget our goal, the purpose of our studies, and if we go too fast, then there's a risk that we'll become discouraged. We might say to ourselves, no, it's too hard, it's too intellectual. What's explained in this text is too hard, too intellectual, and we'll get discouraged. And then what he clarified is that we need to develop patience and put in some effort in order to surpass this obstacle of discouragement. The fourth obstacle that he mentioned is mixing up ideas, amalgamations. What he explained is that we receive so much information. We've learned many things over the course of our lives, at school and elsewhere. And in fact, we mix all of these things together. And it's important to be able to distinguish, to be able to separate what we've learned elsewhere from what we are learning in the context of the Dharma. If we start to compare everything and mix everything from the very beginning, then we won't be able to understand what's being said in the text. So he explained that it's important to keep these 4 points in mind when we're studying. And so since that's what we're doing over the course of these afternoons, we wished to share this with you. Now we'll begin the explanation of the 12 Ayatanas. So to begin, Khenpo explained the meaning of the word Ayatana. Ayatana is a Sanskrit word, and it's translated in Tibetan by the term kye. Kye or kyewa in Tibetan means to emerge or arise. So what is emerging here? Mind and mental events. Mind and mental events. These are topics that we looked at in the chapter on the the aggregates. Mind refers to consciousness, sense consciousnesses, and the mental consciousness. We could say what is the intellect. And the mental events are what appears from these consciousnesses, such as different afflictive obscurations like desire, attachment, aversion, jealousy, etc. And other mental events that are positive, such as confidence, trust. So these mental events are what appears from mind. So when we talk about Ayatana in Sanskrit or kye in Tibetan, this term, kyewa, refers to emerging or emergence, and what is emerging here is mind and the mental events. Mind and the mental events emerge based on certain conditions. And then they direct themselves, they direct themselves toward an object. They focus on an object. So that's the explanation of kye in kye. Now we come to chepa, which means to deploy or develop. So following emergence, there is deployment or development of the knowledge of an object that occurs. First, there is the emergence. I don't know if it's first. There is the emergence of mind and mental events. They're focused on an object. They know an object. Okay. And then there is deployment or development of this knowledge of the object. So this is what we can understand with this term kitche, emergence and development. Again, this refers to the emergence and the deployment of knowledge. Khenpo specifies that in certain texts, this term, Ayatana, is explained as referring to a source, an origin. In these texts, a source refers to the fact that when a cause is present, a fruit or result appears. But in this case, this doesn't concern a link where a previous moment produces a following moment. Rather, this concerns dependent arising, where something appears based on something else. If we put it another way, concerning the different factors of knowledge, it's necessary to see them not in terms of a causal relationship where one thing then produces the next thing and then produces the next thing until knowledge is complete. In fact, the factors that allow for knowledge to emerge and deploy are interdependent events. If we take one of these factors away, then knowledge cannot be produced. In general, if we interpret an Ayatana as source, this fits, but if we consider the word itself, then this particularly refers to the aspect of emergence, and it doesn't include so much the aspect of deployment, because this term, source, refers to the source of knowledge, in other words, more its beginning, its origin. So this term, source, doesn't fully describe the process. As we saw, after emergence, there's also the deployment of knowledge that is involved in this process. Okay, it's okay for this definition of the term Ayatana. So we'll continue. First I'll explain the outline of this section of the text. To begin, there is a general presentation of the chapter on the Ayatanas. You can find the outline on the third page of your printout. So there's a general presentation of the chapter. The second part will be a detailed explanation of the last two Ayatanas in the context of the Buddhist theory of knowledge. And then the third part will be an additional explanation concerning the aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas. And it's a conclusion of the first three chapters. We'll begin with the general presentation. There are 4 parts within the general presentation. First, the identification of the 12 ayatanas. Then, the presentation of their definition. The third part explains how all phenomena are found there. And the fourth section is a reference to other classifications. Ju Mipham Rinpoche often reminds us that it's important to know the outline of the text that we study. It allows us to better understand the sections that we're studying, because the outline itself gives information, and then reminding ourselves of the outline helps us to retain the different information in the text. We'll begin with the identification of the 12 ayatanas. The text says, the I dhatu and the I ayatana are one and the same thing. They are simply 2 contextual ways of classifying them. Thus, the 10 form dhatus are the same 10 ayatanas, and the mental object dhatu is the mental object ayatana. What the text tells us here is that there is a correspondence between the list of the dhatus and the list of the ayatanas. Dhatus is the theme that we studied in the previous courses. We saw in that section that the 10 material dhatus are the 5 sense objects and the 5 sense faculties. And these 10 material dhatus correspond to the first 10 ayatanas. It's exactly the same thing. The I dhatu is the I ayatana. Then there is the mental object ayatana. The same goes here. This corresponds to the mental object dhatu. There's no difference. We saw when we studied the dhatus that the mental object dhatu was made up of the 3 aggregates of sensation, distinction, and conditioning phenomena, and also the non-indicative forms and unconditioned phenomena. That's just a quick reminder of what is included in the mental object dhatu and the mental object ayatana. We won't go into the details here, that would take too long. Next, the text says, the 7 consciousness dhatus are included in the mental ayatana. The 7 dhatus that are consciousness are the 5 sense consciousnesses, mental consciousness, and mental faculty. So we find all of this in the mental ayatana. So this explains why we go from 18 dhatus to 12 ayatanas, because we find 7 of the dhatus within one ayatana, the mental ayatana. So the 5 sense consciousnesses are the 5 consciousnesses that know sense objects, the visual consciousness that knows visual objects, gustatory consciousness that knows gustatory objects, so those 5, and then mental consciousness knows mental objects, but not only. We'll look at that in detail. And the mental faculty is one of the 6 consciousnesses that has just ceased and will produce the following moment of mental consciousness. It's not really different than the sensory or mental consciousnesses, but it's kind of the movement or impulse that allows for the appearance of the following moment of consciousness, particularly, or in this case, a moment of mental consciousness. Because mind is made up of a series of moments that follow each other. It's not a big whole that is static. It's a continuity and continuum of moments of consciousness. The mental faculty is what allows for the next moment to appear based on the previous moment ceasing. So the mental ayatana is made up of the 5 sense consciousnesses, the mental consciousness, and mental faculty. So then the text says, therefore there are 12 from the eye and visible form ayatanas up through the mental and mental object ayatanas. So as we can see, this makes a total of 12 ayatanas, the 10 material ayatanas, and the mental object ayatana makes 11, and then the mental ayatana 12. The different dhatus are included in the list of the ayatanas, but they are classified in a slightly different way. There are 7 dhatus included in one ayatana, the mental ayatana. So next we come to the presentation of the definition of the 12 ayatanas. Here the text says, furthermore, the 6 inner ayatanas, from the eye to the mental, constitute what grasps. The 6 outer ayatanas, from visible form to mental object, make up what is grasped. Because they grasp and are grasped, Consciousness emerges through them and deploys itself toward an object. They are thus called Ayatanas. Khenpo Rinpoche didn't give explanations about this, but if we just paraphrase what we find here in the text, the inner Ayatanas are what grasp, and the outer Ayatanas so these inner Ayatanas are the consciousnesses and the sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness. So that's what grasps. And the outer Ayatanas are what is grasped. The outer Ayatanas are all the sense objects, visible forms, gustatory objects, all the way up through the mental object, which is made up of the aggregates of sensation, distinction, and conditioning phenomena, as well as non-indicative forms and the unconditioned. So that's what is grasped. And then concerning this second sentence, because they grasp and are grasped, consciousness emerges through them and deploys toward an object. They are thus called Ayatanas. This second sentence is what Khenpo Rinpoche explained previously. This term, Ayatana in Sanskrit and Kyeche in Tibetan, refers to consciousness that emerges and deploys. And by way of the outer and inner Ayatanas, consciousness emerges and deploys. This is why they are called Ayatana. How are you all doing? There'll be time for questions. Don't worry, there'll be time. We can take a short silent break if you'd like to refresh our neurons. We have concluded the part concerning the identification of the Ayatanas and their definition. Now we come to the third point, which is how all phenomena are found there. There is an explanation of the different elements that are included in each of these categories, the aggregates, the dhatus, and the ayatanas. We may ask ourselves, how many phenomena are there in the aggregates? How many phenomena are there in the dhatus, the ayatanas? As we saw earlier, and as Olivier mentioned, the elements found in these three lists are mostly the same, just presented in a different way. So we may wonder why there are these different presentations of these same elements. As it was explained in the beginning, this is in order to abandon the notion of a self as truly existing. In this process of abandonment, if we think about the true existence of a self, we'll see that it is the product of conviction. So we analyze how this conviction arises. We use it occurs based on reasoning, and we will pacify or clarify this reasoning. And so this is why these different themes were presented in order to remedy different reasonings for grasping at a self. Among Buddhists, from the listener vehicle all the way up through the Vajrayana, everyone agrees, what is to be abandoned is samsara. Samsara in and of itself cannot be abandoned. What we need to abandon or give up is the cause. There is no other means besides giving up the cause in order to give up samsara. What is the cause of samsara? The view of a self. All of the practices, from those of the listener vehicle all the way up through the Vajrayana, are necessarily antidotes to the view of a self. They need to be antidotes to the view of a self. If this is the case, then this is the practice of the path. If these things are not antidotes to the view of a self, then there is no practice of the path. If whether we are prostrating, reciting prayers, going on pilgrimage, studying, all of this is to remedy the view of a self. Therefore, all of the different presentations of these various elements found in the aggregates, the dhatus, and the ayatanas, their goal is to remedy the view of a self. So now we'll continue with the root text, which states, the 5 aggregates include all conditioned phenomena, but they do not include unconditioned phenomena. Because conditioned and unconditioned phenomena are included in the dhatus and ayatanas, all the knowable is included in these two. What is said here is that for Buddhists, knowable phenomena are divided into 2, conditioned phenomena and unconditioned phenomena. There is no knowable phenomenon that is not included in these 2 categories. So when we focus on a phenomenon, we see it as a self that has an identity. how are these two categories connected to the three categories? As the root text states, all conditioned phenomena are included in the aggregates, and the dhatus and the ayatanas include not only conditioned phenomena, but also unconditioned phenomena. This is why there is no, or not a single, knowable phenomenon that is not included within these categories of the aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas. When these categories are explained, this introduces us to the fact that there is no support for a self other than a dependently arisen composite or gathering. The support for the view of a self is just a whole that appears dependently, but we take it as truly existing. However, it is not truly existing. In Buddhism, we define real, what is real, as being what is independent, individual, and permanent. Therefore, there is no real support, true support for the view of a self. Therefore, this view of a self is unfounded, illusory. And nevertheless, we believe in it. This concludes the part on the correspondence between the aggregates, dhatus, and ayatanas. Now we'll look at the fourth point in this general presentation, which is the reference to other categories. The root text says, due to the preceding detailed explanation of the categories of the dhatus, we also know the meaning of these categories for the ayatanas. In other words, for the details about what the ayatanas are, refer to the teaching on the dhatus. For those who were not present for the previous courses on this topic, there are regularly courses on this theme within Dhagpo's program. So this concludes the first part of this chapter, the general presentation of the ayatanas. And we'll begin the second part, which is the detailed explanation. And the rest of our course right now will focus on this detailed explanation, the next 2.5 days. This is the presentation of the classifications of designations coming from the last two dhatus. The root text states, now let us present several classifications of designations coming from the mental and mental object ayatanas. The second part that we are going to look at explains Buddhist theory of knowledge in relation to the mental and mental object ayatanas. Mipham Rinpoche will explain certain aspects over the course of 12 points. Here, Khenpo Chödrak Rinpoche, before continuing, he gave an introduction to the Buddhist theory of knowledge in order to help us understand the following section of this chapter. This Buddhist theory of knowledge, it is called Tsema in Tibetan, Perhaps you've heard this term before, or you may in the future. Tsema, this refers to the Buddhist theory of knowledge. Sometimes we also say valid knowledge or exact knowledge. For my part, I will stick with the Buddhist theory of knowledge, or Tsema, for now. This Buddhist theory of knowledge describes the different types of knowledge, the way that they function, and how they know their objects. The goal of Tsema is to show which are exact types of knowledge. In order to know what is exact knowledge, we need to know the opposite of this, in other words, which are inexact types of knowledge. This is why they will be explained in this chapter. We will look at this on Monday. What is the process involved in exact or inexact knowledge? Mind considers different factors linked to its knowledge of an object and comes to a decision about the object. It evaluates the exactness or inexactness of its decision. Tsema explains all of the details of this process of knowledge. Based on these explanations, then we know which knowledge is exact and which knowledge is inexact. Khenpo gives us an example. When we hear about the existence of past and future lives, we can suppose that this affirmation is correct, but this doesn't concern true knowledge. We suppose that things are this way because someone that we trust said so, but we don't really know if this is the case. And so there may be doubts concerning our supposition. And if one day this person who told us this acts in a certain way that causes us to lose confidence in them, our belief in rebirth may disappear. This knowledge, therefore, is not exact. It's what we call a supposition. This is why the Buddha said, "Do not believe the words that I have pronounced just because I have pronounced them. You must examine and analyze what I have said in order to reach certainty. In other words, knowledge that what I have said is the truth." Therefore, in order to know if rebirth exists or not, we must refer to reasoning that proves that rebirth is exact. If it is correctly proven that rebirth is something exact, then we are certain of this knowledge of the existence of successive lifetimes. Once again, if it is proven correctly that rebirth is something exact, then we are certain of this knowledge of the existence of successive lifetimes. Buddhism explains that the mind stream is what goes from one existence to another based on habitual tendencies present within the mind stream. As it has been explained, the two base characteristics of mind are to be animate and knowing. What is reborn is this animate and knowing knowledge. If we understand this, exact knowledge will appear and we will be convinced that we will be convinced of successive existences to the point that there will never be a change in this understanding. And in order to truly know this process of rebirth, we need to learn the different ways of functioning of mind as it is explained in Tsema. So that was an introduction to the Buddhist theory of knowledge. And concerning this detailed explanation, there are 3 subparts. There is a general presentation, how mental consciousness creates designations. Then there is a specific explanation, the list of the most important designations. And the 3rd subpart, the integration following these presentations. We'll begin with the general presentation, which explains how mental consciousness creates designations. The root text says, mental consciousness also knows, notably, I's object, visible form. Because it also knows the existence of the 5 faculties due to their correlation with the consciousnesses, all the knowable is its object. So first we will examine the functioning of the 6th consciousness, mental consciousness, and the functioning of the 5 sense consciousnesses. The 5 sense consciousnesses, they know their respective objects based on their governing faculty, which is their unshared governing condition. This means that if we take the example of eye consciousness, it will know visible form based on eye faculty. And this eye faculty is not the faculty that allows ear consciousness to know its object. Meaning that this eye faculty, it is unshared, not shared with the ear. This is why we say that the faculty is a governing condition, an unshared governing condition. Because the sense faculty is specific to a sense consciousness. It is not common to or unshared, not shared with the other consciousnesses. With visual faculty, we can't hear a sound. Visual faculty is not common or not shared with the other consciousnesses. It is specific to the visual consciousness. To say it another way, each sense consciousness knows its specific object based on its specific faculty, which is not shared with the other consciousnesses. Okay. The sixth consciousness, mental consciousness, has a vaster functioning in terms of knowledge, vaster than the sense consciousnesses. What does it know? It knows its specific object, which is an unshared object. In other words, unshared, not shared with the other faculties. Just as visual consciousness has its specific unshared faculty and its specific object, visual object, an object that is not shared, well, the sixth consciousness also has a specific faculty, mental faculty, and an object that is specific, that is not shared, which is the mental object dhatu, or mental object ayatana. So that's identical to the functioning of the sense consciousnesses. However, in addition to this, mental consciousness is able to also know all of the objects of the sense consciousnesses. For example, the object of ocular knowledge. So not only does the mental consciousness know the mental object ayatana, it also knows the objects of all of the sense consciousnesses, for example, visual objects, etc. For example, a visual object is perceived by visual consciousness based on its unshared governing condition, which is visual faculty. But this visual object is also known by mental consciousness. Mental consciousness knows all that the sense consciousnesses grasp. On this subject, the Buddha said in a sutra that mental consciousness is like a king, and the five sense consciousnesses are like the ministers of their respective departments. Then the text says, furthermore, concerning the inner aspect, it belongs to a single continuity of knowledge, and it knows itself. What's said here is that mental consciousness also knows itself. Mental consciousness has an aspect that is inward looking, and due to this, it also knows itself. This knowledge that knows itself, or self-knowing knowledge, is a crucial point. What Khenpo said here is that when self-knowing knowledge is explained, we might think that we understand it immediately, but we really need to examine this self-knowing knowledge in detail. It's a very important point, And for the moment, even if we've heard some explanations about this, we don't understand the process of self-knowing knowledge in a subtle way. What does this self-knowing knowledge consist in? How do Buddhists define this self-knowing knowledge? What is said is that from the moment that there is knowledge, it has an aspect that is inward-looking. And this is true for all types of knowledge. It's true for outer knowledge or mistaken knowledge. There is always an aspect of knowledge, any of these types of knowledge, that is inward looking or inward facing. And this inward aspect of knowledge is the simple fact, the simple experience of the animate and knowing characteristics of this knowledge. It is a simple experience of what is animate and knowing. These two characteristics, animate and knowing, are the fundamental characteristics of knowledge. Animate meaning each moment of knowledge follows another, that these moments of knowledge successively follow each other, and then there is the knowing aspect, the aspect of knowledge that is knowing, that is inherent to knowledge. So this inner aspect of knowledge is the simple experience of these animate and knowing aspects or characteristics of knowledge. And self-knowing knowledge is always unmistaken. When we talk about experiencing the two characteristics of knowledge, animate and knowing, it means there is simply the experience of this in the moment without any thoughts or concepts concerning the knowledge at hand that are additional. There's just the experience of this animate knowing aspects without any thoughts on top of that. And here there is no error, there's just the experience that's present. There's nothing else that is coming into play with this knowledge. However, concerning orientation toward an object, and particularly conceptual knowledge, there are many things that accompany knowledge. This is why these types of knowledge are like conceptual knowledge or object-oriented knowledge. That's why this type of knowledge is said to be mistaken, because there are a lot of additional things that accompany these types of knowledge. Next, it's said in the text, due to this, the knowledges of the 5 doors and mental consciousness itself are also the object of non-conceptual mental consciousness. Thus, all phenomena are the object of mental consciousness. This is why conceptual mental consciousness can designate the whole of inner and outer phenomena, thus allowing it not to overlook any knowable phenomena. Mental consciousness is twofold. it is conceptual and non-conceptual. The 5 sense consciousnesses are always non-conceptual. And simultaneous to a moment of sense consciousness, there is a non-conceptual moment of mental consciousness. Mental consciousness is twofold, conceptual and non-conceptual. Sense consciousness is always non-conceptual. And when there is a moment of sense consciousness, there is also a non-conceptual moment of mental consciousness. So to begin, when visual consciousness, one of the 5 sense consciousnesses, knows a visual form, this visual form is a specific object, and this specific object is momentary. The specific object is the concrete object, the object as it is. In this case, a material, visual or visible object. We'll see there's a distinction between a specific object and a generic object. We'll explain that in more detail in the following sections, but what is important to know here is that the specific object is the concrete object. When visual consciousness knows a visible object, it is a specific object, it is momentary. It only lasts a moment. So here we have a non-conceptual moment of visual knowledge that appears, that knows this specific object. And when a moment of non-conceptual visual knowledge arises, there is simultaneously a moment of non-conceptual mental knowledge that arises. The nature of non-conceptual mental knowledge and the nature of non-conceptual visual knowledge are both, from the point of view of their inner aspect, self-knowing knowledge. So we have this moment of knowledge. There is a moment of visual knowledge that knows a specific object, a visual form, and simultaneously there is a moment of non-conceptual mental knowledge. And both of these moments of knowledge have an inner aspect, and this inner aspect is self-knowing knowledge. Experience, the animate and knowing, the experience of the animate and knowing characteristics of knowledge. What is the functioning or the activity of the non-conceptual aspect of mental consciousness? This non-conceptual mental consciousness triggers conceptual mental knowledge or consciousness. And when conceptual mental consciousness arises, then we think, this is this, this is that. We will apply a designation to outer and inner objects. And at the end of this conceptual process, we say, we've understood the meaning. Concerning a visual form, a table, for example, visual consciousness perceives the specific object, table. At the same time, there's a non-conceptual moment of mental consciousness that triggers the process of conceptual knowledge of mental consciousness. We'll apply a designation to this and we'll say, this is a table. And at the end, we will have understood, this is a table. Khenpo gave an example to illustrate this process. He gave the example of Alan, but Alan's not here, so let's take Barbara as our example. When I see Barbara, here's what happens. First, visual consciousness registers or records the specific object that is the visual form of visible form of Barbara. This is a non-conceptual phase. At the same time, we could say behind this, then there is the non-conceptual process of mental consciousness. This non-conceptual process of mental consciousness occurs simultaneously with the non-conceptual process of visual consciousness recording or registering. Then comes the conceptual work of mental consciousness. And when the conceptual work of mental consciousness occurs, then the continuity of Barbara's 5 aggregates is not there anymore. And the visual consciousness has also concluded. At this point, what's present is simply the work of conceptual mental consciousness. It's no longer linked with Barbara's 5 aggregates or the visual consciousness. We could say it's in its own process. So we could say it's on its own trip, its own cycle. It's connected with its own functioning. And this will treat generic objects. We'll look at that in more detail later on. This mental consciousness will label, it will attach names. And then from here we'll say this person is good, this person is bad, all of the chatter that we can associate to things, with things. And then the text says, therefore, all phenomena are the object of mental consciousness. It allows for knowing what phenomena are, and it is the agent of engagement and non-engagement. What is said here is that what knows all knowable phenomena is mental consciousness. It's also said that it is the agent of engagement and non-engagement. Khenpo Rinpoche didn't say anything specific about that, but in Khenpo Nuden's commentary, there was a short explanation, so we decided to share it. The agent of engagement and non-engagement notably concerns what is to be adopted and what is to be rejected or abandoned, given up. So that covers our session for today. If you have any questions, we have 5 minutes left. I didn't understand the link that was made at a certain point to say that all consciousnesses have a part that are inward, even those that are mistaken, and then from there we went on to something completely different. Does that mean that all those that are mistaken are conceptual and we can't apply what came after? At a certain point, I don't know if there was something said where every knowledge has an aspect that's inward, but it's not because they have an inward aspect that they're exact, because they can also be mistaken. So for me, there's something that doesn't make sense there. Maybe I have to go over everything again, but that troubled me. What makes it exact or inexact? Is it that it's non-conceptual? Well, we'll look at this in detail further on in the text, but just to quickly reply to your question, if I understood correctly, whether knowledge is mistaken or not, conceptual or not, there is always an aspect that is inward looking or inward facing, and an aspect that is exact in a certain way. Self-knowing knowledge is present, but it can be more or less veiled or hidden, so far as I understand it. Nevertheless, there is always this aspect of self-knowing knowledge. When knowledge is mistaken, this inner aspect is not known. It's not conscious, even though it's there. But on the path, well, we'll see the details of this later, but there is the possibility of having access to this self-knowing knowledge, and it can be cultivated in order to reach a true understanding of the nature of mind. But this aspect of self-knowing knowledge is not known or conscious when knowledge is mistaken. So that means that within knowledge that's mistaken, this self-knowing knowledge can be a path to something exact. Indeed, this aspect of self-knowing knowledge is always present, even if knowledge is mistaken. This self-knowing knowledge does it have the ability to see that all phenomena are empty of reality? Self-knowing knowledge is the simple fact of experiencing the animate and knowing characteristics of knowledge. The answer is explained later, so I'm not sure that it's worth going into it here, but just to say it, it's not knowledge of emptiness. Based on this, then knowledge of emptiness and the true nature of mind can be developed. It's related to what knowledge fundamentally is, but without understanding the absence of reality or emptiness. Can this self-knowing knowledge have the ability to see these moments that are only moments and establish itself in this knowledge from moment to moment, and then no longer grasp the phenomenon in the moment? Does it have a capacity to kind of surf? Maybe it's not clear. Let me try and simplify my question if it's not clear. Does this self-knowing knowledge, this ability for flexibility to see the moments of knowledge that succeed one another, and does having this ability to follow without grasping, to have this clarity and flexibility from moment to moment, indeed, it knows what is animate and knowing without adding anything else. I think that's what you're saying. That there won't be grasping around that or on top of that. We won't say, oh, this is animate and knowing knowledge. It's this, it's that. It's just that. Yes, this is what I understand. It happens from moment to moment without there being a mix with other information. But we'll look at all of this functioning later on. I think it'll get clearer. I'd like for it to get clearer within. It's 4:30, so I propose that we conclude here and continue tomorrow.
Sunam di tamshe zipani tomne nyepe chanam panjene kega nachi balam chupai silpe tsole jowa jowa shon.